Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive with Dr. Rebecca Risk. Do you ever feel that even though nothing seems seriously wrong and you pass all the medical tests, that you still feel that your health, pain, and fatigue are completely out of control? It doesn't have to be that way. Listen to the tips and suggestions given on our program today and take back control of your health. Now, here is Dr. Rebecca Risk.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Today, we're talking with Nicole Cozean. She is a pelvic floor physical therapist and founder of Pelvic Sanity, where her team treats men and women with pelvic pain and pelvic floor dysfunction from across California and around the world. We're discussing her book, The Interstitial Cystitis Solution. Nicole, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So can you just tell me what made you decide to write this book?
Okay, so I started out as a physical therapist, just doing orthopedics first, and found a really passion for pelvic physical therapy, treating men and women with pelvic pain. And in doing that, I started to see a lot of people that had interstitial cystitis or thought that they had interstitial cystitis and were kind of on this crazy journey of not knowing exactly, when they were going to get diagnosed or how they were getting diagnosed, and their doctors were seemingly confused. And so I started to get really interested in this condition. I was like, why in the world is this how can this be so confusing? Because we were getting people better by treating their pelvic floor and pelvic pain symptoms. And so I started to just do a ton of research and found that there was so much misinformation on the internet. And, the internet can be a blessing and a curse. So it's great that people can look and find things that maybe they wouldn't have had access to previously, but there's also a ton of misinformation out there, and so IC was one of those conditions where it seemed to be really bad to me in terms of the just straight up incorrect information. And so I started to think about maybe blogging about it and whatever, and my husband's actually a writer, and he said, you should just write a book. And I was like, I can't write. I suck at writing. And so, that sort of is how it sort of started. He pushed me to write a book. I ended up just blabbing to him about everything in the Icy Solution was in my brain, and I couldn't put it down on paper until he helped me get it down. So the organizational part of the book is like all him. It would have just been word vomit otherwise.
Well, I've read some of those books, so they're okay too. It's just a little harder to find the information that you need. But, just because we're good at something doesn't mean we're good at writing about it. So it's great that you had his help with that.
Totally.
So I just want to talk about what interstitial cystitis is, and you've called it IC, just so everybody knows that's the abbreviation for interstitial cystitis. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, and funny you should mention in the book I call it alphabet soup, right? There's all types of alternative terms for interstitial cystitis. IC is one of them. It's now been also called painful bladder syndrome, PBS, or bladder pain syndrome, BPS. It's also been called, hypersensitive bladder syndrome, all kinds of other things. But IC is pretty much the most used phrase now. IC is a bladder. I call it a condition. Some people call it a disease. I like the connotation of a condition better than disease, but it's once talked about as being a bladder disease, but in fact it's actually more of just a pelvic pain condition in which there are bladder symptoms. And so the biggest symptoms are urinary urgency and frequency. Many people with IC find that they think that they have an UTI. They're misdiagnosed with multiple UTIs before. And I usually describe it as like UTI times 1,000. It's not just simply a UTI. It's very much painful, urgency, frequency, burning, and then suprapubic pain or pain right above the pubic bone. And those are the two hallmark symptoms, is the urinary symptoms and then the pain symptoms from it.
So I mean, this kind of sounds, most women have been through this, thinking we have a bladder infection, and often we do, but this sounds like it's a little bit different, a little more extreme, obviously, and I'm guessing not an infection.
Yeah, definitely. It's not, although it can, a lot of times people can be diagnosed with an infection and actually have a positive UTI, urinary tract infection, and then the infection clears and then the symptoms remain. So that is one way that IC can sort of manifest. And then the other way is that you continue to get negative urine cultures even though you swear you have a UTI, and even to the point where some physicians will just give you rounds of antibiotics because you're so adamant about the fact that you have one, even though you're testing negative. And so, and so I call those like phantom UTIs. It's like you swear you have one, it feels exactly like one, maybe even more painful than one you've ever had, and then but all the urine tests and stuff keep coming back negative. And so then the question is, well, what else is going on, and what is actually causing that pain? And so that's the big question. And I think that a lot of people blame the bladder, when in fact, as we've gone through, and we just had a big in 2014 or 2011, had a huge study that studied all of the symptoms of IC and everything, and they found that a lot of them can be coming from the pelvic floor, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later, but that the bladder is simply a innocent bystander in this complex web of pelvic pain symptoms. And so I think from a physician standpoint, it's very easy to blame the bladder because it does feel so bladder-like, and there are bladder symptoms associated with it, right? Urgency and frequency of urination. But in fact, there's a lot of other things going on which can be causing the pain and irritating the bladder.
So before we go into, in more details about that, what the cause is, I want to talk about the history of interstitial cystitis. Interestingly, I did a show with Maya Dusenberry on August 13th about her book, Doing Harm, which was about how women have been treated in the history of medicine, and also how we're still treated. And, reading your book and a few other things on IC, it kind of seems like the same thing is happening in this category as well. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this story is actually really interesting, and I think we'll see here how that's happened with IC as well. So the first time that IC was ever really recognized was in the early 1800s. IC was initially categorized as something called a bladder tic, which was almost suggesting like there was a nerve problem as the root of the condition. And it wasn't until 1876 that the term interstitial cystitis was actually used, and cystitis just means inflammation of the bladder, and interstitial is like the middle part of the bladder, and so that was the name interstitial cystitis reflects the impact that the inflammation has on the bladder. So then in about 1914, around the start of World War I, a urologist named Guy Leroy Hunter found these, what he classified as, quote, elusive ulcers in the bladder of some patients. And these ulcers now have the name Hunter's lesions. And so researchers then, from that point on, for about 50 years, assumed that all patients either had these Hunter's ulcers or would inevitably develop them. And so, but then you're having the people that get tested for them that don't have them, and that sort of started to be like, oh, well, does this really exist? Why doesn't this person that seemingly has IC have these ulcers? Maybe she's making it up. And so that's where I feel the stigma of IC sort of happened in that 50-year period. And it wasn't until 1978 that there was a study out of Stanford where researchers actually demonstrated that the vast majority of patients with IC actually don't have Hunter's lesions at all. And they've actually proved that the condition could be present without Hunter's lesions. And so then you start to have all of those different names of what is it really, and so but that started, I believe, the stigma of it. And as early as as late as like 1970, even urology textbooks, and I'm sure you read this in the book, but I'm going to go ahead and just read it from it. It says, this is now in a urology textbook where doctors are reading this and learning about it, and it says, it makes a thoughtful physician wonder about the possibility of a mildly masochistic woman with the destructive need in the female to suffer and to have, quote, unquote, trouble with her genitourinary apparatus. And so I feel like that wasn't that long ago. And so 1970, that's what they were still learning, and that was still getting taught by urologists that, oh, maybe these people are just a little bit crazy, and that they're having some masochistic tendency to have a problem. And so then fast forward to the 1987s, there's a formal definition of interstitial cystitis was finally created in 1987. And then the American Urological Association, fast forward another 20 years, first published their first guidelines on IC in 2011, and then they were just recently updated in 2014. So it's been a long road for IC. I think just recently we're starting to understand that men can have the condition. I think that, this is where internet is a little bit of a blessing. I think that patients aren't standing for that, oh, just relax, you have to have a glass of wine, it's your anxiety, that kind of stuff. I think people are now standing up a little bit more to people that say that to them. And so we just need to keep pushing forward. And as a medical community, we need to understand the journey that the condition has taken and really be mindful of the struggles that people go through as well.
Well, speaking of those struggles, of course, in my research, I was online, and when you go on Instagram or you look at help groups where they talk about IC, it sounds devastating, and women are depressed and suicidal, and they feel alone, and the medication's not working, and they're told, urologists are still saying to people that I don't believe that this is real. So what kind of impact does that have on people?
It from a practitioner standpoint that actually treats, I treat a lot of people with IC, and I would say that the fact that the patients come in and they are starting so low in terms of their psyche about they've just been beaten down by either the medical community or they've looked for support in support groups and stuff, and everybody seems to have the same story, right? No one's listening to them. They're starting to doubt themselves. Maybe I am really making this up in my head. Is it really that bad? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I have is to rewire that thought that this is a disease. I'm not going to get any better. My life is over. That kind of thing. Because we do. And the first sentence of my book is thousands of people with interstitial cystitis live healthy, pain-free lives, and so can you. And so I really truly believe that. And I feel like it's destructive for to think that you can't, and that's one of the reasons why I don't like calling it a disease. I know that that's what it technically is, and I don't mean to discount at all the difficulties that someone goes through with this condition, but there are so many ways that you can break the cycle of pain and inflammation and nervous system upregulation. And so there's so many things that we can do to manage it and even get to be symptom-free. That's the message that I wanted to bring out with the book, and hope that all of my patients understand too, is that this is not the end of the world. This is difficult and challenging, and it sucks a lot of the time, but that you can do a lot of things about it and to get symptom-free.
Well, thank you for sharing that information, because when you read all those the desperation. I'm glad that there is a place where people can get the information and the proper information, as you said, and to know that there's hope. Because I at first had read that actually in Maya Dusenberry's book that IC actually has a very high suicide rate, and then when I went online researching it, I did discover that is how people feel. And I do think it starts there's the inflammation and the pain and how disruptive it is, but when we don't believe people, if you're a doctor and you have a patient in front of you and you tell them it's anxiety or in their head and their whole life has been destroyed, what do you have? Right. So like you said, we need to change the perceptions of not only this illness, but of course how women are treated. And, we really do know what's wrong with our bodies. And it should be that can be taken at face value.
Yeah, and then I definitely think, too, that part of it's been very interesting to see some of the younger generation of people that I see, like in their 20s and even in their teens, don't take their doctor's word for that as much as somebody in their 40s or 50s does. So I think that hopefully as now that there's like a generational gap in that there'll be put more pressure on the American Urological Association, the urogynecologists to make sure that if you're going to treat IC, if you're going to say that you treat IC, that you need to be educated in the most up-to-date manner. And if you don't, then you at least need to refer. If you don't want to treat people with IC, that's fine, but they at least need to refer them to someone that does, or refer them to a reputable source of information, or refer them to the AUA guidelines, which I talk a lot about in the book since they were just revised in 2014. And so as a patient or someone that doesn't know if they have IC or not, those guidelines can be really helpful in sort of a litmus test of how well your doctor and your medical team, number one, knows the condition, and number two, is treating you per those guidelines. And so it's a really good test to see, like, oh, is this person right for me? And don't be afraid to change your practitioner. From a physical therapist, an acupuncturist, a physician, just don't be afraid to get the right team for you, because there's a lot of people out there, and you just got to find the right fit.
Oh, perfect. We're going to take a quick break. We're talking today with Nicole Cozean, and we're discussing her book, The Interstitial Cystitis Solution. We'll be back shortly.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
Healthcare has been a major part of news stories today, with one thing that has been consistent: inconsistency. Both healthcare providers and patients have to work around and get used to a constantly changing set of rules and issues. Nurses have historically been left out of this decision-making. Listen to Once a Nurse, Always a Nurse, Exploring the World of Nursing with host Leanne Meyer. Health professionals, we invite you to share your ideas and experiences while listening to experts in various areas of nursing. Listen Mondays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
Everything is energy. It's all connected. Your energy can be seen as the foundation for your life and impacts all areas of living. Do you realize that your thoughts have the power to affect how you show up? Tune in for Healthy Energy with Margot, featuring host Margot Nielsen. Margot and her guests will show you that connecting to your energy is vital to your health, relationships, money, and more. Listen live every Monday at 12 noon Pacific Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel.
Now you don't have to stay linked to your desktop or laptop. Take Voice America on the go and listen anywhere. Get our mobile app for iPhone, BlackBerry, or Android at the Apple iTunes App Store, BlackBerry App World, or Android Market.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're talking with Nicole Cozean, and we're discussing her book, The Interstitial Cystitis Solution. So, Nicole, I want to talk about what causes IC. Do we know this?
Oh, good question. We technically still do not know what causes IC, and that can be pretty disheartening to a lot of people. But I try to spin that positive because I feel like we put so much emphasis on, what we don't have a cause, therefore we can't find a cure, and then we cannot let that fact that we don't totally know stop us from doing what we can about the symptoms and the condition itself. So here's what we do know. We know that interstitial cystitis is a multifactorial problem. If it were a single cause, this has been researched for a long time now, and people are always trying to search for the cause of it. If we could find it from a bladder marker, if it was hereditary, if it was an inflammation that's only inflammation, if it was nervous system only, we would have found that out already. And so the biggest thing I think to take away is that it's a very complex and multifactorial issue in which there are multiple causes in varying degrees for different people. And so that's what we have to figure out. That's what my job is as a pelvic physical therapist, is to figure out what percentage essentially is coming from, let's say, the pelvic floor, because the pelvic floor can cause bladder pain and urinary urgency frequency. And the nervous system, upregulation, stress, anxiety can actually cause bladder symptoms, and it can influence pain. What is the estrogen's role? We used to think that estrogen played a huge role in IC, and it's been shown to be varied. I mean, some people feel better on their periods, some people feel worse. So we know that it might affect somebody, but that it's not the cause. And so what percentage in that patient right in front of me is that. Now, if they also have another comorbid condition, meaning another associated condition that also affects potentially inflammation, a big one is endometriosis or PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Like if somebody has that in addition to IC, then maybe the hormonal fluctuations there also impact the interstitial cystitis symptoms. And so the biggest thing I think to realize is that it's multifactorial, but that's, in my opinion, very positive, because that means there's multiple things that can influence symptoms. It's not just one thing. And so the more sort of darts we can throw at the board and hit the board, then the better you will be in the long run.
Well,
so
and also
I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, well, I think mainly what that tells us is that we don't understand, which it seems like a lot with, I mean, there's a lot of illnesses that we don't understand. One thing that I did notice, especially doing a little bit of research, is that most people that are affected by IC also have other illnesses. I mean, the list was quite long: IBS and lupus and fibromyalgia. And I mean, I'm sure you can talk about this more, but it just seemed like it was, and mostly women at this point have been diagnosed, that, we're disabled by more than one thing. So they, were very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and so, is there could still be a common denominator of, some people are looking into the autonomic nervous system to see if that is truly a cause, so it's just, I just feel like the fact that we don't know means that there's a lot of things we can do about it. And the other thing about that is that what we do know about it, too, is that it's not just the bladder lining. And I think that's where a lot of people, too, that's where a lot of myths come from. I mean, the bladder lining is affected in some patients, and maybe even in the majority of patients, but it is not the only cause for symptoms. And that's where it gets super confusing on diagnosis. And we used to think that we could diagnose interstitial cystitis, like we could see it and in the bladder and by a cystoscopy, which is like a little camera that goes up your urethra and looks around. And while it can diagnose Hunner's lesions, even if the bladder lining looks irritated, that doesn't mean you have IC. And the American Urological Association actually has specifically stated that cystoscopy cannot diagnose IC. And so, I call it the cause conundrum. The cause conundrum also bleeds into the fact that it's difficult to diagnose, right? Because if we don't know the cause, then it's hard to test for it, and then the diagnosis becomes difficult. And so, ironically, sometimes when people come into my office, they say, I don't know, I think I might have IC, or my doctor says I don't have IC, but I feel like I do. And my response to them is like, okay, like either way, whether you do or don't have it, you have some symptoms of urination issues, right, with urgency frequency, and some sort of pelvic pain, suprapubic pain, perineal pain, whatever. And so in that way, like I can help with that no matter what the label is, And so I think that that's the biggest thing is it's okay if you don't know if you have it. And it's okay if you've been diagnosed with it. Either way, there's multiple things that you can do about the symptoms to get your life back.
So, I mean, I was going to ask you how it's diagnosed, but I guess now we know it is one of those elusive things unless you have an ulcer. It may not happen. And also you may have a urologist or a doctor who, believes the old textbooks that, it's not a real thing. I don't know what person would want to go through IC on purpose. But for some reason, it doesn't sound very pleasant. And actually, I'll just get you to describe what it feels like and what somebody's life is like especially when they're starting with it and they haven't done any treatment before they get it under control. What does that look like?
Well, the thing is it looks really different for a lot of people. So it can look as simple as someone's going to the bathroom a lot of times with the occasional pain episode or flare, or it can look as devastating as you can't get out of bed, you can't be more than a few steps away from the toilet. People's lives are affected in terms of their personal life. A lot of times another really common symptom of interstitial cystitis is painful intercourse. And so a lot of people have their relationships very much affected, both sexually and just otherwise. It's difficult to be the partner of someone that's constantly in pain. I feel that a lot of people, if they didn't have anxiety to begin with, end up having anxiety about being away from a bathroom, going to being in a social situation where you don't know if you can get away. A lot of people have difficulty at work. Because, if you have a job that requires you to be away from a bathroom or you're in a meeting or something, and you're the one who's always having to get up or can't work because of pain, it can be really impactful, totally impactful in all aspects of your life. I have a lot of moms with IC that feel like really terrible about themselves because they feel like they can't be the mom that they want to be. And it can be super impactful in someone's life in all areas. But there is ways that we can help with all those things. And so, I've gotten people back to being able to run again and exercise and play with their kids and get back to work and stuff. And so there's lights at the end of the tunnel for all that. But we can't discount how hard that is to get there, and how much like perseverance you have to have through the ups and downs of flares and everything. So it could definitely be very impactful. And like you said, anxiety and depression is high in this group for good reason, because it's a big deal. But I think that the more that you assemble a good medical team, the more that you are open with your family about the things that you're struggling with, and if you can find a good, I'm going to plug a little bit of pelvic physical therapy. We're the people that see you like once or twice a week for however long it takes to get you better. So if you find a good person like that can be both your cheerleader and the quarterback kind of your medical team, then there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Which is great to hear. I want to talk a little bit about some of the misinformation that's out there. You address some of it in your book, and I know that there is a lot out there. And I think part of this comes from the desperation people are in and the lack of information. But can you just address some of the things that people are talking about?
Absolutely. And, a lot of this comes in because, like we were talking about, we don't know the cause, therefore diagnosis is hard. And there's just so much misinformation about this. And so here we're going to go through a couple of the myths, right? Myth number one, IC is just solely a bladder condition. If we only treat the bladder, we are missing a huge piece of the IC puzzle. And so that's why sometimes if a person goes into the doctor and they get put on Elmeron and they have installations and then they wait 6 months and then magically nothing happens, that's because IC is not just a bladder condition. So that's one myth that we try to bust a lot. Even though you're having bladder pain and bladder symptoms, there's a lot of other reasons and other things that can irritate the bladder. Pelvic floor is one of them, and there's a nervous system is one of them, and anxiety is one of them. And so that's where that's one of the big myths. The other myth is that IC is rare. There's actually a lot of people that have this condition, and so I think up to 12 million people. That's the most current number that we have. You'll probably, if you read, see it anywhere from 4 million to 6 million. But the RAND Corporation did a study that's called the RICE study, RICE, which stands for the RAND Interstitial Cystitis Epidemiology Study, and they actually anticipate that it's more like that's where the 12 million comes from. So that's probably how many people. You are not alone if you have it. So that's that. And then one of the other big ones. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, there's a lot of myths around that it primarily affects women. And one of the biggest things that came out of the RICE study was that chronic prostatitis and interstitial cystitis might actually be if not the same condition, very similar. And so over 90% of men that had been diagnosed with something called chronic prostatitis could also have been diagnosed with IC. And so that, I think, is a myth that's perpetuated in the literature, that it mostly affects women in their 40s. And that helps to delay diagnosis for a lot of people that are either younger or that are men or that are even older. And so that actual statistic came from one paper a long time ago out of one county over like a 50-year period where they studied like 20 people. And then they came with the, quote, average age of 40 years old. And most of those people were women. So that's the study that everybody quotes as, IC affects women in their 40s the most, and that's incorrect. And there's just as many people that have 20 years old. Symptoms actually can start in their teens, and men can have it too. So I think that's a big myth we got to bust a lot in order to number one, get the proper diagnosis, because a lot of times if you're 20 years old and you're going into your urology office, they're not even thinking about that diagnosis because they've been told or read that it's mostly women in their 40s. So it would be super, quote-unquote, rare to have IC in your 20s, and that's just simply not true. And that's now been proven. So.
Well, and it's important to talk about this because in your book, the 12 million people is the same as how many people have heart disease or depression. So when this is called a rare illness condition, whichever word we're going to use, it's not. And I think that's really important. Yeah, that there's probably a lot of people who haven't been diagnosed because it's not taken very seriously. And if it's either diagnosed by symptoms or by a cystoscopy, then it's very unlikely you're going to get that unless it's very severe.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then the other thing that the RAND study showed us, or the RICE study showed us, was that of those 12 million people with symptoms of IC that could be diagnosed with IC, only a little less than 10% were actually diagnosed with IC. And so if you haven't been diagnosed yet, but you think you have all those symptoms, then seek help as if you do have it, because at the end of the day, we're going to end up trying to break that pain cycle at all these different areas, and we can get symptoms better. I don't care if you have IC or not, we can still help. And so I think that's a big thing that people get stuck on a little bit. They get stuck in a rut trying to go to doctor after doctor, trying to, quote, get the diagnosis and figure out what's wrong. And in the meantime, we can be combating symptoms and doing lifestyle changes and getting your family involved to help you and support you. And so I think that it's important to go through and make sure that there is nothing else more severe, more significant, and rule out other things. But at the end of the day, if we don't get the perfect answer, then that's okay. We still need to pursue getting your life back,
Right. Well, exactly. We are going to take a quick break. We're talking today with Nicole Cozean, and we're discussing her book, The Interstitial Cystitis Solution. We'll be back shortly.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
Explore the power of natural healing with Howard Strauss. Join us each week for an informative program that'll help you learn effective healing methods using natural remedies. Howard's guests include top researchers, authors, and experts who will share their views on a variety of natural products and healing methods that really work. Tune in to The Power of Natural Healing with Howard Strauss, Mondays at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel.
Addiction can affect our relationships, our families, our home, and work lives, but most importantly, ourselves. The recovery process can do wonders in the lives of people suffering from active addiction and also for those that love them. It's not just 12-step programs, but so much more. It's learning how to live life on life's terms. If you can relate to these issues or love someone who does, start with yourself. Start by tuning in to Miracles in Recovery with host Ray Lynch, Mondays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. Hope is in your corner.
Have you become a member yet? Sign up now to become a member of Voice America. It's always free and easy. Plus, you get to take advantage of some great member benefits. Get unlimited access to millions of hours of on-demand content across all of our channels. Keep track of your favorite episodes, shows, and hosts in your own customizable library. Find out what shows you might be interested in based on your favorites. Plus, you get insider access with our newsletter. Membership gives you more. Sign up at voiceamerica.com and click register at the top right.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're talking to Nicole Cozean, and we're discussing her book, The Interstitial Cystitis Solution. So, Nicole, there's a couple of things I want to talk about. One of the first things people do, it seems, when they're looking at help for this is their diet, because everybody talks about the interstitial cystitis diet. So what is that?
So that's a great question. So the Icy Diet was originally, it's a diet that takes away flaring foods. And there's a little bit of misconception as to what foods actually flare and what foods don't. And you should do a lot of research on this if you have IC, because it's not necessarily that all acidic foods are bad. Some people believe that there are histamine-releasing foods that are bad, which is true, and that create inflammation. But the bottom line is that if IC is a multifactorial problem in which some of it is the bladder lining, then not all people are going to be the same with their diet. So the IC diet actually got started by a survey that basically asked people what foods trigger you, and that created an IC food list. So I like calling it an IC food list. We've simplified it to call it the diet, but what we don't want to have people do is restrict their diet too much unnecessarily. So there are certain people that definitely have food sensitivities, and some much more than others, but there's some people that don't, or don't have it a lot. So the average IC person has basically 5 to 7 categories of trigger foods. The most obvious of those are citrus, tomatoes, spicy, carbonation, caffeine, alcohol, right? So if we eliminate those things, then we can see if that helps symptoms. But the diet itself is not, or the IC food list is not a do not eat list. It is a figure out if those things are bothering your symptoms. And I always try to have people, for every single thing that you take out of your diet, you need to find a safe food to put back into your diet. Because I've had too many people come into my office that are scared to eat, that are physically malnourished because they've restricted so many things because they think that that's all that is causing their pain and bladder issues, and that's just not true most of the time. So you can do an elimination diet, and a lot of times putting together either a nutritionist or a dietitian to help you with that. You can find your own food sensitivities with the help of a natural medicine doctor or an allergist, and then that's the food diet that you should follow, is the one that's specific to you and your symptoms. And there is no standard IC diet that works for everybody.
Well, and this just is, it sounds like everything else where the symptoms aren't the same for everybody. The treatment isn't the same for everybody. Different medications, different supplements, different diet, different ways to do, the physio or anything else that people decide to do, acupuncture or whatever else people are doing. So it's different and it's individual, which is what I loved about your book, is it can help people figure out what is their spectrum in this, because nobody is the same, as you said, right off the bat, is that nobody looks the same with us. There are certain symptoms, but it varies person to person, and it sounds like the same with treatment as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's you got to find a team that can guide you to find your best treatment plan, you know what I mean? So some people, that diet is like the thing, and they have to be super restrictive. And then if you have IBS on top of that or something else, then dairy might be your biggest food trigger for your IC. So we got to find out individually for you, with everything else that you've got going on, what is the best way to do it. But I don't like when people perseverate over the diet, because then you're missing a huge piece of a lot of other things that you can be doing that can help your symptoms.
Well, exactly. So now I want to get into the physio part, because of course this is your specialty. And so when can you just tell us what that means when somebody's getting pelvic floor physio?
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, and I could talk about this for hours, so I'll keep it short, but the pelvic floor is basically the setting for your bladder. So your pelvic floor is our muscles that go from your pubic bone to your tailbone and your sit bone to your sit bone. It creates this literally floor of your pelvis. Your bladder actually sits pretty much right on top of those pelvic floor muscles, and those muscles wrap around the urethra and the bladder neck, and are intricately involved in urination, right? So they have to relax in order for you to fully void. They have to contract in order for you to hold back urine, and then they have to be at this perfect little normal resting tone in order for you to do all these other, just to be living without peeing all over yourself or feeling like you have to pee every 2 seconds. So the pelvic floor is our muscles, and they also have nerves that go through them. And the biggest thing that I can say for people is that 90% of people with IC have some pelvic floor dysfunction. And what that means is usually with IC that those muscles are a little bit too tight, a little bit too wound up, a little bit too much wrapping around the urethra, and because your bladder sits right on top of them, the muscles themselves can irritate the bladder. And here's the thing, because your bladder only knows one language, all it knows is, I have to pee. So if it's getting irritated from a muscle, all it's telling your brain is, I have to pee. And so pelvic floor muscle dysfunction can actually be causing some of the urinary urgency and frequency that people feel. It can also be responsible for some of the pain. Just like you can press a muscle in your shoulder and you can have a headache, that's an example of it referring pain to somewhere else. That can be happening in your pelvic floor as well. So we can touch a muscle in your pelvic floor, and then that can refer pain into maybe the suprapubic region or the region right above your bladder. And so there are so many muscles of your abdomen and your legs, your inner thighs play a huge role in bladder pain. Even your calves and your gastroc, they play a huge role in bladder pain. So that's why I feel like a pelvic floor physical therapist or physio can really help to distinguish what muscle problems somebody has that are affecting the interstitial cystitis symptoms. And for most people, it can be super helpful in helping to calm down symptoms, calm down the nervous system, decrease pain, decrease urinary urgency and frequency. And then, of course, if maybe your pelvic floor is causing 50% of the symptoms, but that's 50% of the symptoms that can be helped with just that. And so then we can sort of start to look into the diet or look into other medications that can help. But there's a huge muscle component to IC. And so I hope that everybody can get a good pelvic PT on their team. We're not all created equal, to be quite honest. And so if you've tried pelvic PT in the past, then I really feel like, and it hasn't worked for you, then don't be afraid to try someone else. We all have different backgrounds and expertise and ways of, and personalities, honestly. And so I feel like it's a great quarterback for your team, because I feel like we understand both the medical side as well as the muscle nerve side, both of which are really important for IC.
Well, and it is really important to talk about it. I mean, even if it's not getting to the root cause, say, but it's 50% of your symptoms, then why wouldn't you pursue that so that you can get rid of 50% of your symptoms? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
It does make sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would even say that for the majority of my patients that we can get the majority of their symptoms under control with pelvic PT, and really figuring out where the irritation of the muscles is coming from. Because the other thing is that there's a nerve that goes through those pelvic floor muscles that have, we call them afferents, but they have connections to the bladder. And so most of the time those are called silent nerves to the bladder. But the pelvic floor muscles that are dysfunctional can turn on those nerves to the bladder and make your bladder feel like it has a UTI, make the bladder feel like it has to pee. And so there's just so many, I can't emphasize enough how many different aspects of your pelvic floor, the muscles and the nerves of your pelvis can influence your bladder symptoms. And so those things really need to be addressed for the full healing.
Which definitely makes sense. And I love that you've put this all together for everybody. I mean, your book is very easy to read. I guess we can thank your husband for that. And
yeah, totally. Otherwise it would be like, what?
Yeah, and it is broken down, and I think for people who are either very sick or also suffering from something else, if there's brain fog or just fatigue or anything like that, your book is still easy to go through, and you can still help yourself with it. And although we're not going to have time for this, you talk about a lot of other things that people can do to help themselves, how to talk to your doctor, some medications, because doctors may not know. I've heard, I actually saw somebody online talking about your book, and they said they take it with them to doctor's appointments because, it lists the medication, and their doctor isn't educated because there isn't much education on this. So it's very helpful for somebody who's suffering to take this book with them and say, this is what I need it. It's recorded. This is, how you treat it, and have their, open their doctor's eyes. Maybe they can help someone else as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That made me really happy to hear that, because that I love it when people take control of their own health, right? And your doctor's just a human, and if you find one that you go into there and you take your stuff and you say, hey, I've read this book and this is what I think, and it should be a partnership, right? It shouldn't just be, nope, that's not right. It's like, that's why I have those tables in there and stuff. So there, even though it's written for a total layperson, it also has enough backing with the research and stuff in there so that you should be able to reference resources and reference articles and stuff so that your doctor will, or any medical professional really, can look at that and be like, oh, this is legit,
Mm-hmm. So that being said, how can somebody get a hold of you or your book if they want more information?
Okay, so we have a blog and a website, and it's pelvicsanity.com. www.pelvicsanity.com. We have a blog there. You can find more information on the book. We are on Instagram as @PelvicSanity, and I'm also on Instagram as Nicole Cozean DPT. We post about this all the time. What else? Yeah, we're on Facebook. Feel free to message us on Facebook with questions. We also have a Facebook group that's called Finding Pelvic Sanity, and you're free to join that if you have any pelvic pain condition, including IC. And we put tips on there for you guys if you're traveling and whatever else. So we're on that quite a bit. So there's a lot of resources there. The Interstitial Cystitis Association is icyhelp.org is also a great resource. I'm actually on the board of directors for the Interstitial Cystitis Association and the Interstitial Cystitis Network. The ICN is also a great resource with very much up-to-date information on there as well. And so, those are like the top, I think, the top places to get information. And the key is up-to-date information as well. So,
yes, well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love this show, and I'm so glad you're able to share everything with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you getting the word out.
So we were talking today with Nicole Cozean. She's the author of the Interstitial Cystitis Solution. If you want more information about my story and my health journey, you can go to my website, dr-risk.com, and you can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or probably anywhere else that there is social media. Thank you so much for listening today. Just be sure to make today a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive. Please join Dr. Rebecca Risk again next Monday at noon Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We'll talk more next week.